confidence that I know a two-headed animal when I see one than I do in the truth of any particular solution to the puzzles posed by such thought experiments. Hence, objections to the existence of a three-headed dog, like Kerberos, based on such puzzles, I find to be not at all compelling. Indeed, I think Howard Snyder will find himself confronted with puzzles parallel to those that he raises. For there are a variety of canine species. Suppose that Kerberos looks something like a three-headed wolf. On Howard Snyder's view, Kerberos, is, if there is such a thing at all, is, despite appearances, not a wolf, but a composite of three wolves. Now, suppose that Bowser is reconstructed by the surgeons using collie parts, and that poor Spike, once a vicious guard dog, wakes up from the surgery to find that his brain has been incorporated into the body of a Chihuahua. It would seem that a new collie and a new Chihuahua have begun to exist, or at least new collie and Chihuahua hybrids, even though Bowser and Spike survived the operation. But then, what were they before the operation? Was Bowser always a collie and Spike always a Chihuahua? Surely not. So are they now really new wolves, which look like, not new, are they now really wolves? They were wolves before, and they're still wolves after the operation, but they just look like a collie and a Chihuahua. Lest Howard Snyder is tempted to bite the bullet and say, yes, they are still wolves, but look like a collie and a Chihuahua, let us suppose that the surgeons lacked the canine parts to complete the operations, and so incorporated Spike's brain into the body of a cat or an alligator. Is Spike, with his reptilian body, still a dog, a cold-blooded, egg-laying wolf? That seems absurd. I think we should want to say that after the operation, new creatures do begin to exist, with which Bowser and Spike are not identical, even though Bowser and Spike survive the operations. Perhaps Rover, Bowser, and Spike are three parts of Kerberos, say his brains, which get incorporated into new animals. Or perhaps Rover, Bowser, and Spike are immaterial persons who become somehow connected with new bodies. Affirming that Rover, Bowser, and Spike survived the surgeries thus does not commit us to the view that they were three distinct dogs prior to the operations. After the surgeries, we have three distinct animals, at most one of which is identical with Kerberos, and the other two being new animals. Rover, Bowser, and Spike endure either as material or immaterial parts of those animals. Hence, Howard Snyder has not proved that Kerberos was not, as the story says, a three-headed dog, but three distinct, if overlapping, dogs. Well, I think perhaps that will be all I say about that by way of response to Howard Snyder. Yeah, let me just say a little bit more. Having dealt with the analogy, in section 4.2, he does turn to a discussion of the model itself. He correctly observes that on the model, God is not a person, though he cashes this out tendentiously as God's lacking the cognitive equipment sufficient for being a self-reflective agent capable of self-determination. Now, this is very misleading, as though on our view, God were not a personal being. But, in fact, our view is that God has the cognitive equipment sufficient for personhood 3 times over, and so is tri-personal. Thus, there's nothing objectionable in the implication of our view that God is not a person. Read, one person. That is part and parcel of Trinitarian orthodoxy. But I think Howard Snyder evinces a disturbing proclivity toward Unitarianism. Thus, the observation of an anonymous referee for Philosophia Christi that, quote, every model of the Trinity must say that God is not a person, end quote, draws this surprising retort, quote, so far as I can see, This assertion does little more than express the referee's myopic view of the options, not to mention his or her disregard for the plain sense of Scripture and tradition, end quote. Yeah, pretty caustic. And here I'm afraid that Howard Snyder is just mistaken. The church has uniformly rejected the claim of modalists and Unitarians that God is a person. Not even anti-social Trinitarians would be so reckless as to affirm that God is one person. We all affirm that God is personal, but Trinitarians reject the claim that God is a person. Now, Howard Snyder draws out three consequences of the denial that God is a person, which he finds objectionable. First, he says the opening verse of the Bible, "In the beginning God created," is false. But this objection is fatuous, since the Old Testament scriptures do not distinguish the persons of the Trinity. When they are finally distinguished in the New Testament, we find that God the Father is typically described as the creator, with Christ as his intermediary. Second, he says, human beings cannot be made in God's image since God is not a person. Again, God's not being a person does not imply that God is void of all personal attributes. We are made in God's image because we are endowed with rational faculties sufficient for personhood, even as God is so endowed. The only difference being that whereas we each have one such set of faculties, God has three. We are personal beings, just as God is a personal being. Finally, his third objection is that the view implies an abysmally low view of the divine nature, since the Trinity exemplifies the divine nature and yet fails to be a person. He says if God is not a person or agent, then God does not know anything, cannot act, cannot choose, cannot be morally good, cannot be worthy of worship. The objection is misguided. Howard Snyder assumes that God cannot have such properties unless he is a person. But it seems to me that God can have them if God is a soul possessing the rational faculties sufficient for personhood. If God were a soul endowed with a single set of rational faculties, then he could do all these things. But by being more richly endowed as a soul, is God therefore somehow incapacitated? How can augmenting God's cognitive faculties make God less knowing, less good, less powerful, less worthy of worship? On our view, it belongs to the divine nature to be a personal being. And a soul so richly endowed with rational faculties is, if anything, more majestic and worthy of worship than a more meagerly endowed soul. I think at that point I will not say any more, though I could say more. I think that is really the heart of Howard Snyder's complaint. So let me ask him if we have any comments or questions then on the model that I'm proposing or on the critique of alternative models that has been offered. Yes, Jay.
Well, one, are you going to, is that going to be printed as a response in Phil Christie?
If it's accepted, I'm still working on it. This is what I've been doing in my afternoons after class is working on this. So
okay, good.
Hope to submit it.
And I guess second, I'm a little bit surprised by his comments. I read the most of the article, and I was a little bit surprised by the way he seemed to equivocate, person with personal.
Yeah.
That seemed to be a real surprising move.
I'm glad you felt that way, because that was the way I felt. He made it sound as though on our view we thought God is not a personal being because he is not a person. And I'm glad you thought that was tendentious, because I did too.
Okay. and although I'm not sure what tendentious is, but that's,
well,
I feel affirmed.
It wasn't a fair-minded critique, I thought, in that sense.
Okay.
Saying that God is not a person, not worthy of worship, and all that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And I think what the referee said was absolutely correct, that this is part of orthodoxy. We're not Unitarians.